Today, I'm going to be showing everyone two mystery focusers that I've ordered off eBay, and one cheap one that I ordered off Amazon because I thought that one was safer, to see which ones can actually hold up to a real astrophotography rig and what it requires, and which ones you should probably skip. We'll even do a little bit of a laser torture test, and we use that to try and understand how much wobble there is in these focusers. Personally, I'm willing to take some chances because some of the gear that you can buy from overseas is really good quality at a really good price. Like this focuser here that's been living on my big SCTs for like 6 or 7 months now, and the focuser that's in this box that we're going to take a look at today. Hi, I'm Francisco, and I have a problem. I keep buying mystery parts from the internet so that you don't have to. The catch is the story with these things can be sometimes complicated. Without great US-based sellers like Agena Astro or Mile High Scientific, getting support can be an adventure. So make sure you focus on that subscribe button and click like if you want to see more wacky things like this off the internet. All that aside, let's see how these mystery focusers actually perform. How do they come into focus? Let's dive in. Roll that intro. First, let's talk about what a focuser actually does for the new people in the room. What problems can show up with the bad ones? Why would you bolt an external focuser like this to an SCT that already has an internal focuser? Who is CYCK? And how do these stack up against what we're replacing? So an external focuser like this looks simple, but it's doing a very precise job. It has to hold your imaging train or eyepiece at the exact point of focus. Right, so that's one thing. It has to support potentially several pounds of gear. Like this is a color camera, but this is pretty heavy, and you've got it all the way out here. It's hanging, a foot off the back of your telescope, and it still has to move this whole stack forward and backwards in tiny steps, sometimes just thousandths of an inch at a time to get you the focus that you really need. For deep sky imaging, the focus point may not necessarily change a lot from target to target. But for visual, every eyepiece has its own slightly different focal point. So if you're swapping eyepieces, you will have to change. And for imaging, if you're swapping filters out, using something like a filter drawer or an electronic filter wheel, that can change the focus. Then there's the big focus changer, which is temperature. It strolls in and says, what if I slowly moved your focal point all night just for fun? So you're constantly chasing this one magic position where all of the, things line up perfectly. And the focuser is really the only thing standing between you and, a flash drive filled with 40 gigabytes of slightly soft images that you can't really use. Let's talk about why basic focusers aren't that great. They generally rely, so external focusers like this will rely on just a few points of contact to create enough friction so that, your eyepiece stays put and doesn't move around, and so that the draw tube stays square to the telescope. On a typical budget focuser like on this or on the SLT-30, which I just did a full setup guide, I'll link to it up here. There are just these tiny little grub screws. Let me see if I can get them in the shot. Yeah, you see these tiny little grub screws. These set sort of the friction preload and the base squareness. And then there's this big knob here that's used to sort of lock the focuser or increase the tension. Now, in theory, this is fine. Like there's nothing particularly wrong with that. But the problem here is you can tighten down the lock screw so much that it actually can push the tube out of square. And when you start trying to rotate it, you'll see, let me see if I can get that on camera. You'll see that the whole tube will tilt just a little bit because it's trying to fight the friction and it's being pushed on by one thing. So, you get to sort of fight this thing the whole night. So secondly, a lot of these focusers have just basic attachment options. So they'll have like a 2-inch eyepiece holder or a 1.25-inch eyepiece holder, which is great for visual, but for attaching a camera, that's not always ideal. Astro cameras generally have threaded front faces on them, which will accept M42, M48, or M54, so 42, 48, or 54 millimeter extension tubes, and those will thread directly into an appropriate tube or telescope in a way that's a lot more solid. A lot of these cheaper focusers don't give you that option, so you end up just clamping using the eyepiece holder instead. And you might think, no worries, you can rotate this thing off. These threads are standard, I'll just adapt it. I've gone through this with so many telescopes at this point for reasons known only to the manufacturers and whatever chaotic engineer designed it. A lot of these will just use random ass thread sizes between the draw tube and this holder here. So like you would expect, oh, this is probably M54. No, I can't tell what it is. And if you do manage to get the one special adapter that'll fit here and convert it to like M54, well, great. Now you're going to end up with a cabinet full of these adapters that really only fit one sort of thing. And I don't know, that's kind of rough. I like standards. I like things to be standardized. And one final thing about these basic focusers is a lot of them are single speed. So they'll just have, they'll have two knobs, but the knobs go at the same rate, which is okay, again, until you're at really high magnification and you discover that that fine focus adjustment is trying to, rotate using essentially your elbow instead of your fingers because you're just trying to turn it just a little bit. Let's go on a small tangent here for one of my favorite types of telescope, the SCT. This is a 10-inch Meade LX200R, but most of the telescopes from Celestron and Meade that are bigger than 9 inches have the same threading on the back that we're going to talk about here. But basically all SCTs have their own special problem, which is something called mirror flop. If you've read literally any forum thread about SCTs and astrophotography, you've seen this. On an SCT, you focus by moving this mirror or this knob here. And what this knob is doing, and I'll put up a graphic of it, it's moving that primary mirror. So when you turn the focus knob, it pushes or pulls on this metal rod that slides this pretty massive mirror up and down this central tube. To let that mirror slide smoothly, you naturally need to have some clearances, and that same clearance means that when you switch from pushing to pulling, the mirror will shift just ever so slightly. Those tiny shifts that we're talking about in the mirror can nudge your collimation, can confuse your autofocus routines. I spent so many nights trying to get autofocus to work correctly with my SCTs, and they can make electronic focusing an absolute pain. So you can bolt a motor to this and have it go, but the autofocus routine is going to freak out. So an external focuser on an SCT lets you get rough focus with the main mirror itself, and then you can, if you have the capability to lock it down, you can lock it down. And what you do is you replace this rear cell here, this is usually the cover, with the focuser itself. And these just screw on. They're pretty easy to use. So this is the one I've been using, and it literally just bolts on at the back here. Get it all nice and snug. And now you have this Crayford focuser. Actually, it's like a rack and pinion that'll move this part in and out, and you can get really fine focus without having to worry about moving that mirror around. We're going to run some experiments with lasers, which I love, to show the difference in how much targets move between when you use the internal mirror and when you use this external fine focuser. All right, SCT tangent over. Who is CYCK? They're this brand right here that's pointed there. They're not a big brand with a fancy website as far as I can find. They essentially just live on eBay and like AliExpress and a couple other of these Chinese hobbyist electronic shops. It's not just a bare focuser that they sell. They sell all sorts of stuff. They sell upgrade kits for Newtonians, so you can get like covers for light leaks. You can get upgraded spiders, which hold the secondary mirrors in place. For these focusers, they make adapters that cover all sorts of telescopes. So they have an interesting product line. And that made me really interested. It wasn't just one company selling one product with a random name on it. There was this consistent name that kept coming up, and that name was CYCK. The flip side to that is there is no central CYCK website I can find. There's no nice documentation library and no sort of compatibility charts. You basically get an eBay or AliExpress listing, some photos and specs in what I would consider slightly chaotic English, and you're sort of feel like the beta tester sometimes, which is exactly why I wanted to buy a couple of them, beat on them, instead of just trusting the listing photos and telling people, you know, whether they were good or bad without ever actually having seen them. So let's talk about how this one has stacked up. This has been out in the field for, I want to say, about 5 months. And I've purchased another one that we're going to unbox right now. They both have arrived in really good shape. They do take some time. I'm on the West Coast of the United States. And for me, I think this one took 3 weeks, and a little bit more than 3 weeks. And the one I just ordered actually only took about a week and a half. And as a tradition, they brought clouds with them. So I haven't been able to do any astrophotography since actually the red one that we're going to unbox right now got delivered. They were packaged well, and I didn't just get a box full of bricks. So this was, like I said, the first one I ordered. It's got the large SCT adapter so that I can use it on my Edge HD11 and my two big Meade LX200s. I have an LX200 12-inch and then an LX200 10-inch, which is the R or ACF. They got sued for calling it a Ritchie Crichton telescope. So, but this is the pre-lawsuit one, so it actually still says RC on it. It's kind of funny. It's a beautiful scope. The listings highlight things like the 2-inch, focuser, the dual speed knob that's here. The machining on all of these are really, really nice. There aren't sharp edges. I mean, maybe a little bit sharper than I'd like, but they're crisp. There wasn't a ton of extra, lube or goop anywhere. Like, they came out of the box. This one came out of the box. I threw it on and I started using it. The features on the actual unit, so it's got these multiple contact points around the tube itself. So there's these two here, and then there's the typical contact points on the bottom side for sort of squareness and baseline friction. And then there's this knob here, which does that sort of final focus lock if you want, if you're using it for visual. This one does have a pretty easy mounting surface for an electronic focuser bracket. So there's these 3 screws here that you can use. You pop this knob off, you would put your bracket here, and that's how I was using it for a while. I put it back to this stock state to make this video. It has a built-in rotator, which is, I thought was going to be my favorite part of it, but it caused some issues. So to use the rotator, you can see there's a rotator ring here, and there's this screw and this screw, and which are sort of the baseline preloads, and then this red screw, which you would use to loosen, and then you can rotate this whole assembly here free from this. It works, right? You loosen it, you can rotate it, and you can lock it down. The problem that I had with this was, let me see if I can actually get to a point where I can show it to you. There's a V groove on the focuser assembly where it meets the rotator. Here we go. So you can see here, there's this groove, and that groove gets bit on by these screws. Well, in my opinion, the screws weren't biting into the groove well enough, so you could, in theory, introduce a little bit of tilt like that. And when you were tightening them down, that didn't go away. So I designed and 3D printed essentially just a spacer. It's 1 layer thick, so it's very thin. And it sits on the focuser side and goes between the focuser and the rotator. And what that does is it takes up a little bit of that slack and makes it so that when you tighten the screws down, you can feel it actually pulling the focuser into the rotator. After making those small adjustments when I first got it, I have to say the build quality is really solid on this unit. There's no strange binding. There's no obvious misalignment. Fully loaded with my full imaging train, which is usually a 2600, a 7x2 filter wheel, and an off-axis guider, I didn't really notice any sag. And the beautiful part is this takes M54, it is M54 threaded on the end. So you take this 2-inch eyepiece adapter off, and in here is just M54 threading. I've heard some comments online that this was like the wrong M54 threading, but all I can say is, you know, I've got M54 threaded things, and here we go. Let's see. Here's a ZWO M54 16.5 millimeter adapter, and it just screws in really nicely. So I don't know if there was like earlier versions of these that had M54 by something weird, but this threads on nice and smooth, and I haven't had really any issues with that. The backlash on this is minimal. It's almost non-existent. But if this tension knob isn't really good and tight at 3000 millimeters of focal length, I can see the stars still move a little bit when I'm racking the focus in and out. But so much less than if you were using the primary or the secondary, or no, the primary mirror to do your focusing adjustment. When I want to do planetary with something like this, I take off the M54 threaded, you know, adapter that goes to my whole camera rig, and I usually just pop the 2-inch eyepiece holder back in, and that lets me just drop in my planetary cameras, and that's worked really well as well. This is the new CYCK focuser that I just ordered. I did open the box and look in there, but I haven't like mounted it to anything yet. So let's see exactly what it is that we get. There's a baggie filled with a bunch of screws. That's good. And the focuser itself. Now, this one I didn't order initially with threads or with the mounting adapter for my SCTs. I'm actually in the process of rehabbing an old Celestron 10-inch Newtonian for some imaging duty, and that focuser is really, really bad. We'll show exactly how bad in a little bit. So this is the CYCK focuser. And the reason that I liked this, at least from the pictures, was all of these bearings here. So the tube itself, the focus tube, rides up and down on bearings instead of on these just couple of friction points. This one reminds me a lot of the Meade Zero Shift image focuser, which I actually have one here. And you can see this was back in the day, Meade was creating, you know, really cool things. This focuser only moves, you know, like, what is that, maybe 15 millimeters in and out. But in order to call it zero shift, they did this cool thing where it actually rides on bearings. This focuser is probably from the late 90s, I think. And so it's kind of cool to see that technique come back in something like this. It's upgraded, obviously. That one has, I think, 6 bearings total. And this one has 12. So there's 3 on each side that form a square around it. And there's actually cutouts in the tube here for the bearings to ride on. What those bearings mean is there's virtually no slop. The draw tube essentially refuses to move in any direction except for in and out. It does have kind of a, I don't know, the tension screws down here on the bottom. You're probably going to remove that when you install an automatic focuser. That's probably not going to be an issue because your electronic focuser will handle that okay. But we'll see. I'll do an update on this over time. It does have an M52 threaded front, just like the CYCK unit that I bought for my Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes. So you know, here's the 2-inch eyepiece holder that it comes with. You unthread that. It's got long threads. That's good. It's got very long threads. And you can just take any old, you know, M54 threading like you would have off the front of your camera, and it just threads right in. Wow, that feels really nice. Okay. A couple other features on, this is the plate that mounts the focuser to the Newtonian telescope, and I'll actually do the install, or maybe I'll roll it as B-roll over here in the corner. And it's got tip tilt adjustment right here. So when you mount this plate to your telescope and you have this mounted up like this, you can access these little screws here. See if I can get those in the shot. Yeah, there's these screws here. So you can actually tip and tilt this whole assembly from the OTA when you're doing your collimation. So that's kind of a nice feature. This one feels better than the first one that I ordered. It feels better than this one in almost every way, but both are miles ahead of any of the stock focusers that you would use. I've never owned a true like ultra premium focuser like the Moonlights or the Feather Touches, and I'm sure those are amazing and probably feel better than these do, but those prices make my eyes water and my wallet leaves the chat. What I want to do is rig this up so that it's firing the laser either from the eyepiece side down through, like on the Newtonian, I can just do that and then see the beam come back. And then we'll rack the focuser in and out and see how much the laser moves. The only reason that laser would move is if there was any slop in this system here. On the SCTs, I don't think I can do that necessarily because there's nowhere for the image to bounce back, or the laser to bounce back. So I think I'm going to shine the laser in from the front of the SCT and bounce it through, both mirrors and probably shoot it out the back at like a target of some sort. And I'll then be able to see the difference between using the mirror to focus, which is the standard focus, and then using the rack and pinion focuser. I'll probably have to put an eyepiece in there so that there is an optical element in the end that can move with the focuser. So let's cut to that and let's see how that went. This is the C10N, the Celestron 10-inch Newtonian that I'm working on restoring. And this is the stock focuser here. This is the big focus tension knob. There are 3 screws here that attach it to the actual optical tube assembly. And I've put in this laser collimator here so that you can see that red dot? That red dot has traveled down into the telescope and then all the way back out. And we're gonna start with the tension on the tensioner set really loose. And what you'll see here is when I move the focuser, look at how much the laser moves. Now it's not a positioning trick that, it's moving relative to the camera. It's actually moving on that target. And this actually isn't that bad, but this is so loose right now that if you had any sort of imaging train on here, it would just slide in and out, or if you had a big enough eyepiece, it would. So now I'm gonna put enough tension that's like a realistic amount of tension on this draw tube here. And now let's see what happens when I rotate the focuser. Now look at how much that's moving. And all I'm doing is slowly moving the focuser in and out. So that's one of the big things we're trying to get rid of. There are these 2 grub screws here on either side of this knob that, again, you can try and adjust to square it up a little bit, but you're always going to be fighting them. And that's sort of what happens when there's only essentially these 2 points of grabbing onto the tube. It's going to end up either too tight or too loose, and without even moving the actual focus point in and out, you're going to move the squareness of the tube. So let's change the thing out. Okay, you should be able to see the beam there in the bottom right corner. You'll want to redo your whole collimation once you've changed out the focusers. But let's see, this is with no tension on the grub screw. Let's see if that laser dot moves at all. Nothing. Now I'm going to put a bunch of tension on it, which was the Achilles heel of the other focuser. Nothing. This is awesome. I can basically rack it all the way in, all the way out, and do those small focus jutters in between, which is what on the other focuser was causing the laser dot to move around a ton. And I get no movement of that dot at all. This is, I think, a really, really worthwhile upgrade. Let's see how it works on the SCT. All right, so now we're gonna try doing with the mirror, and you can see the laser moving in and out. I've zoomed in to make it clearer, but racking the focus in and out is rotating this knob, and that laser is moving pretty far on that paper. And if we rack the focus in and out with the rack and pinion focuser, it's pretty solid. There are some real downsides to going the no name, no brand, Amazon, eBay route. One, and the biggest one, is support is basically the seller's inbox. With the known brand, if something is out of spec or starts to bind, you at least have a manufacturer and a distributor and a seller all to yell at, and one of those people will probably try and make it right. With a lot of the generic focusers, what you get is, like I said, that Amazon or eBay listing, a seller account that might change their name the next month, and return windows that can close long before you notice that that focuser isn't working that well. Some listings even quietly will say things like, mainly used for DIY telescopes, may not be compatible with some telescopes. And this is sort of code for, if it doesn't fit, that's on you, it's your problem. The other issue with a lot of these is the specs are either incomplete or, let's say, creative. Good focusers from brands like GSO, Skywatcher, even the ultra premium ones like Feather Touch usually have very clear specs about draw tube travel, load capacity, thread sizing everywhere, and sometimes they'll even have mechanical drawings that you can rely on to try and understand things like, oh, I don't know, how much spacing is this going to take up in my imaging train if I'm back focus limited or back spacing limited. In my experience so far with the two that I've bought with my own money, these are not affiliated. I'm not affiliated with them. No one sent me these. I spent, I think it was $170 and $160 for these focusers of my own hard-earned cash. I can tell you, I like them. I probably wouldn't order this one again with the Rotator because I don't think it's actually as well built as this cherry red one here with all of the cool bearings and all that stuff. And I think it takes up a lot of spacing, which is critical on a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. So I do have some numbers here. For this black one, the minimum spacing that it will consume if you have this racked all the way in is 74 millimeters. On some of the SCTs, that might be a problem. The maximum spacing when you have it racked all the way out from where most of the companies measure it, which is the flat spot in here, is 115 millimeters. So it'll go from 74 to 115. That's a decent range, but again, I don't know that I would buy this one again. I don't mind that I have it, and it's still a good focuser, but if I was doing it again, I would buy this focuser here. The specs on this one here, hold on, I wrote it down. At a minimum, when it's racked all the way in, this will consume 46 millimeters of space. And at a maximum, when it's racked all the way out, it'll get to 100 millimeters. So it has a bigger travel range, I think because it can support it with all these really cool bearings. CYCK seems to at least be aiming to be the real upgrades for a lot of the Skywatcher and Celestron Newtonians and like the Orions, all of those you can get kits. You can get kits for the smaller Schmidt-Cassegrains and the larger Schmidt-Cassegrains. So let's talk through these things quickly. Stock focuser, fine for visual, starts to fall apart for any serious imaging. The CYCK that I have for the SCT, the one with the Rotator, it's a solid upgrade for the SCT. It passes the laser and bubble tests well enough. It has minor quirks with the Rotator that I was able to fix with the 3D printed spacer. The CYCK Newtonian Hot Rod Red unit is rock solid. 12 bearings, passed all my tests with flying colors, and it feels like a real upgrade for scopes like this Newtonian or for the SCTs. And the reason that I say that it's an upgrade for both of those is I've already ordered the adapter to go from this red focuser to the SCT, large SCT threading. Unfortunately, even though these parts look like they have similar sizes, like this adapter here and to this adapter here, they don't fit. I was hoping that they would, but again, this is where you run into trouble with eBay specials where you don't actually, they don't list the specs well. So I had to buy a new one of these adapters specifically made to fit this red focuser. That's kind of cool though, because I can have one focuser that I can use on multiple scopes without having to spend a ton of money. Now the adapter is not cheap for a piece of metal. It was like 35 bucks, but that's better than having to buy another one of these focusers at 150. So that's a huge perk for these CYCK units. You can swap the base plates and adapters to move them between scopes. With all that said, if this saved you from buying the wrong focuser or maybe got you interested in ordering one of these CYCK units and you want to support the channel and more mildly sketchy gear experiments where we buy random stuff on the internet, you can buy me a coffee at the link down below. Also, if you're currently fighting your focuser, drop your scope model in the bottom and what camera you're using down in the comments. And I'll tell you if I would upgrade it or if I'd leave it alone. That'll also give me ideas for future videos. For Deep SkyLabs, I'm Francisco. Thanks for watching. Clear skies, and when the weather finally cooperates, may your focusers never flop.